So I'm David Velasco, the editor-in-chief of Artforum magazine, and today I'm speaking with Joan Kee, the professor of the history of art at the University of Michigan and the Robert Sterling Clark visiting professor at Williams College. And also, I should add, a contributing editor of Artforum for a number of years now. You wrote the cover story for our May issue. It's called For Asian Lives to Matter, and it's a very compelling piece on Chao-Chen Yang's 1942 photograph, Apprehension, which was a touchstone of the 2008 show, Asian American Modern Art, Shifting Currents, 1900 to 1970 at the De Young Museum in San Francisco. And I wondered if you could speak a little about what that show meant at the time and the photograph's role in the exhibition.
The 2008 show that you mentioned at the De Young was, in fact, the first large-scale survey of Asian American art to take place. So that spanned production from the late 19th century to what was then the present. And what was noticeable was not only the variety of works shown, but I was very struck by how Chao-Chen Yang's photograph, Apprehension, was singled out and kind of set forth as the face of that particular exhibition, without any particular rationale as to why. I suspect it was in some ways an image that encapsulated some of the unsaid anxieties that accompany any use of the term Asian American. Now, this was something that did come up in the many reviews of the show, not all of which were positive. A lot of the reviews talked about how the show merely added on to identitarian politics in such a way that didn't move the discussion as far as it should have. But that image has always stuck with me. And for someone who tends to work by looking at particular artworks rather than thinking about how artworks fit into some kind of larger narrative or pre-existing current, that I've always wanted to write about this work. But it never dawned on me why until what happened in March with the murders of 6 Asian women, but also the assault on a Filipino-American woman, literally right in Midtown, in broad daylight of all times.
Yeah, no, and you know, it was very striking. You pitched this piece in late March in the immediate wake of those murders and the assault. You know, and it's rare that scholars mobilize art history, I think, to so quickly address events in the world, specifically violences. And I wondered if you could tell me what moved you to write and why you chose this photo in particular to do a close reading of for this issue.
So one of the other kinds of currents that we've seen, especially with the Black Lives Matter movement. So I also volunteer part-time as a lawyer in Detroit. And it was very striking how images have been mobilized or not mobilized to advance a particular narrative. And with regard to anti-Asian violence, there have been a certain group of images that have been forwarded, not necessarily as a remedy, but as a kind of declaration to not look upon Asians as being the enemy. So a very prominent example would be the cover of Time magazine that was issued quite recently. But the issue with those sorts of images is that what does it mean to actually represent an entire community? And I thought it was very important to have an image that kind of stepped away from that looked at this particular crisis not in terms of some kind of triumphalist narrative, but rather to think about what sorts of pressures does a single body take on in this kind of atmosphere where you don't know what's going to happen to you. And this is, again, one of sort of the points in which we can also see a convergence of minoritarian fears, is that you don't know what's going to happen to you when you walk on the street. You know, police might attack you. A random guy might just try to kick you in the head, for example. This image was a channel for me to put into words some of these feelings that have been percolating, but which for me hadn't really found the right outlet.
Sure. Could you actually speak a little bit about Chao-Chen Yang himself? You know, he's not a figure I think that's well known in art history, and you know, it's this is an incredible opportunity to, to actually get a view into his work as well.
So Chao-Chen, so he was born in China and he comes to the United States as a diplomat following a career as an officer serving under Chiang Kai-shek, the former president of Taiwan some decades ago. And he comes to the United States and eventually takes up photography while he's based in Chicago. So he's the vice consul of the Chinese embassy, the Republic of China embassy there. And he takes some classes in Chicago and becomes really immersed in photography and starts thinking about it as a career. And this is while he's also working full-time as a diplomat. Now, he goes to Seattle in the early 1940s. And he also spends a little bit of time at RKO Pictures. So well-known movie studio. This is before Citizen Kane is made. And he goes there with the intent of perhaps becoming a cinematographer, taking photographs professionally for movies. One of the interesting things about Chao-Chen, one is that, so he's based in Seattle, which may explain why we don't know so much about him, or rather that the information about him is really kind of limited to the Pacific Northwest. There's going to be a retrospective of his work in a few years, so I'm hoping that will change that. But Chao-Chen was also someone that experimented very early on with color photography. And this is well before the 1970s, before, say, some of the major debates about color photography would take place. One other sort of interesting aside about Chao-Chen is that in 1949, he's someone who's about to be deported from the United States, because this is the year when Mao Zedong establishes the People's Republic of China. So people like Chao-Chen, so he was part of the national side. He really can't go back. I mean, the only sort of option is for him to go into exile to Taiwan. But when you speak with members of that generation, this was something that was just utterly humiliating, that they had to be forced back, that they were effectively exiled from their countries of birth. So this was not really an option for him. But in 1949, he's in some ways, he's stateless. And so I think what he's also done was to take on board that experience, and he becomes an advocate for other stateless Chinese, namely seamen, some of whom are actually illiterate, who don't read and write any language. And this was also at a time when immigration laws really start to mandate quotas on Asian immigrants. So one of the other sorts of points that I think we discussed was initially when I saw Apprehension, it was dated as 1951. This was at the De Young Museum, and it said, Chao-Chen Apprehension 1951. And that year for me was very interesting. One, because this is just after China enters the Korean War. So China under Mao Zedong enters the sides of North Korea into the Korean War. This also coincides with Joseph McCarthy, someone that we all know all too well. And that starts to fan even the flames of xenophobia become even hotter and become even, say, more expansive than they were before. And this also couples with the fact that something that's interesting about 20th century American history is how the yellow peril equation tends to oscillate between the Chinese and Japanese. So during World War II, Japanese were the bad guys. After World War II, when the US needed Japan as a crucial military and political ally in the Pacific, suddenly they were the good guys, and the badness kind of transferred on to China. And so again, Chao-Chen being someone who is of Chinese origin, this is something that he would have been exceedingly well aware of. So this is also why I think that year 1951 was particularly interesting. But as we found out, that was not the correct year.
Correct. No, during the research phase, actually very, very late in the editing of the piece, we heard from Yang's son Edgar that the work was in fact made in 1942 or around that time. So that kind of changed. That changed the context for the image immediately, and you had to revisit the piece at this time to actually accommodate and think through what that might mean for the image. And you did this very gracefully, actually. It's kind of incredible, how you were able to do it. But I wondered, what that meant for you as you were revisiting the piece.
You know, the funny thing about the date is that it actually didn't change the import of the work, at least for me. So 1942 is the year that Franklin Roosevelt signs an executive order basically expelling Japanese Americans out of their homes. It's the order that started the internment camps, which initially were called concentration camps in this country. And Chao-Chen, so he's based in Seattle. So he sees his friends, his neighbors, they're all forced into, to give up basically their worldly belongings and go into these conditions that are just unspeakable, especially for, given that they, most are US citizens. And 3 years before, he had gone to Canada with a couple of friends. So 2 friends, they were white, and then himself, they were in Vancouver taking some pictures. Again, Chao-Chen is really interested in photography and wants it to be his career. And they get apprehended by Canadian police who claimed that they were spies. And the language was which they used to refer to Yang and his friends, a Jap and 2 Germans. So again, already that kind of wartime, say, racialization is already in play. And so 3 years later, when he creates this picture, Apprehension, that memory has in some ways shaped, or I'm arguing that it's had to have structured the way in which that image brings in our attention. So that's 1939. But in 1942, you also have Life magazine publishing How to Tell a Chinese Person from a Japanese One. So it's one of the sort of very well-known pairings of images that is often presented in Asian American history classes, again, to show the magnitude by which surface appearance was somehow taken as an index of someone's moral character, or whether or not they even deserve to live or exist, for example. And so Apprehension appears, I think, within just months of that pairing being published. And that pairing, by the way, is not just limited to Life magazine. There are other publications that published very similar kind of guides, how to tell the good Asians from the bad.
It's very interesting to me that, near the end of your piece, you actually use this it's sort of a slippage to read Apprehension alongside the work of other Asian American artists, including Yoko Ono and Taishing Hsieh and Teresa Hak Kyung Chua. And I wondered why did you bring all these people together? And did you feel like there was a risk in kind of like threading the needle through these different timelines, these different stories, these different histories so quickly?
Mm-hmm. One of the reasons why I brought up the works of Ono and Hsieh, and of course the savage murder of Cha, is one, to emphasize that this kind of violence directed towards Asians, or rather the anxiety in which, if you are raised as Asian, that you are subject to, this is not something that was some kind of event in 1942 or something that only happened in March of 2021, but rather that it has always been systematic, that there is a certain recursivity to the kinds of attacks, whether the attacks are physical, in the case of Taishing Hsieh, for example, who was assaulted by an irate white property owner who caught him sleeping during the course of his outdoor piece, or if the violence is psychological, as in the case with Yoko Ono's cut piece, where there are instances that maybe the law, it doesn't really call for legal intervention, but maybe it should, just because of what we can perceive of her body language or the expression on her face, or audience reactions to what is being done to this woman who is just seen as kind of inert. So one of the questions that I wanted to end on, and I say question because one is that I don't wish for this work to be read simply as some kind of declaration, but rather, how is it that this kind of recurring violence, in whatever form it takes, what can we actually do to, one, be aware of it, but also convert that awareness into some kind of action that might, again, divert us direct us towards a a less damaging future. Because I think this is another point. One of the other reasons why I think Apprehension works is because it's not a period piece. It's not just relevant to the time for which it was made, but it's something that reminds us that certain kinds of times is framed by antagonism or irrational violence or the degradation of other people. This is something that is always kind of embedded into our culture. And so how is it that this photograph allows us to chart this history, but to chart that history in order to think about another kind of future that in which all of these violences may not happen?
Or at the very least, we would know how to name it, which is, something that I think a lot of people have struggled with, is actually naming the violence against Asian Americans and people of Asian descent in this country. That, it's often a very discounted kind of racism, which makes it all the more insidious. So, there's an especially beautiful line where you also consider apprehension in light of this woodcut from around the same period, a few years later, called The Bridge of People by Guyon. And you use this moment to wonder whether Asian bodies, this is quoting you, Asian bodies are visible only in the light of emergency, whirling flashers, raging infernos, the hellfire of bombs, even the overhead glare of an interrogation cell. It's one of these very profound moments when you link aesthetics and politics. But it's also a moment when you say, maybe I'm overstepping, that you hesitate because it is, it's not maybe the most natural reading to do in art history. These images that weren't, you're making a context for them that maybe was not there, to begin with.
Gu Yuan and Chao-Chen Yang are on ideologically opposing sides.
Right.
Chao-Chen Yang probably wouldn't have appreciated that comparison just because, again, Gu Yuan is someone that is very much affiliated with Mao's communism. And Chao-Chen Yang, to my knowledge, worked his entire life against what he saw as an ideology that did not serve his country. So I was very hesitant in bringing that in, but there is something about the resonating colors of Apprehension and that particular woodcut that in some ways, once you see it, you can't discount it. So in Apprehension, the colors that you see, again, it's very sort of this rich, deep, these golds, yellows, oranges. And it's also the kind of light that, and this is something that I often do when testing out different ways of describing artworks is, so I put up both a candle, but also I also had made a small bonfire just to see what the effects on skin would be. And the light that Yang, the light that Yang uses is definitely not that of a candle or even say incandescent lighting. It's really more how flesh might react when seen in the proximity of, say, a large fire. And so that really had me thinking about the Guyon woodcut, because the most noticeable thing about that woodcut, other than the running soldiers, is that giant sort of cloud of orange kind of on the right-hand side. And that's the kind of orange that tells the soldiers there's not just war, but there is death, and you are running towards that death. And so this is also another way I wanted to also think about how do artworks work, not just within, say, a particular ideological framework or within the intentionality of their makers, but how is it that these artworks are coming together to have a conversation about these spaces of, again, imminent destruction or imminent, in Yang's case, imminent displacement or removal or some kind of, say, death, whether it's physical or whether it's metaphorical. How does these works come together to make a case for why this kind of death has to be recognized and reckoned with?
This is a very unique piece, Joan, in the sense that it does, it's a close reading of a single work, and that I think does allow you these kinds of these metonymic slippages, these other kinds of ways of translating histories through the image. There's a poetry to the language and to the kind of thinking animating it that I think allows you to go further than a lot of traditional art historical pieces would. Of course, I've read many of your works over time. You are also a legal scholar, and you have this incredible analytic mind. But do you feel like this was a unique piece for you in terms of the kinds of approach and reading and language you were using? Or
I did. One, because one of the things you're taught in legal law schools is to strive for objectivity or detachment of some kind, to kind of put yourself outside of the equation. But for me, this is one of the few writings that I've done that my personal investment is such that it was impossible to even think about detachment as an objective or goal, just because in the violence that has occurred, not just in March, but for many, many years, decades, centuries even, is that you can't help but see yourself or see someone that's close to you that could have been that person. And that's, again, that level of intense proximity made this particular piece very difficult to write in some ways, because with every word, I felt that I wasn't quite doing justice to what it is that not only Yang sensed, but what it is that this work also anticipated that had yet to take place. So this was for me probably one of the most difficult pieces I had to write, in part because I was thinking, how do I not make this about my own self at the same time recognizing that this piece, of course, is about the self and about many other selves with which one is intimately connected to.
It's beautiful. It's also, I do think it's a very hopeful piece in the sense that you do, you end with this question, which, I can, to acquit these bodies and therefore release ourselves from the torment of mutually debilitating suspicion, such as the decision apprehension urges us to make. Because it's not a question, but it's, you give us an actual way forward, which, in a piece that actually discusses the anticipation of violence, both from daily violence on the street to the potential of violence from the state and the law, you've left us with this other kind of anticipation of maybe a future in which we can, we can actually move beyond or understand this legacy and what we can do with it. So, it's, I
thought maybe it was, the ending also for me was difficult too. So I was thinking, is this too pat? Is this too Pollyanna-ish? Because again, as someone who does some volunteer work in criminal defense, is that, one of the first things you realize very early on is any change you make is not just incremental, it's almost nanoscopic, that the barriers to affecting any sort of radical shift in attitude are just so overwhelming that in some ways all you can hope for are just very, very small steps. So I was thinking with that ending, maybe it's too hopeful. Maybe this is something that people will be like, what is she smoking, or what is she drinking? Maybe I can use some of that. But I thought it was important to perhaps end on a note that may be more positive than I actually, or maybe some others might actually feel about the state of things now, just because in some ways it's an act of overcompensation that perhaps it's tactical. So it's a tactical kind of overcompensation that's needed in order for us to think, okay, that's where the sort of the minimum baseline should be, rather than think, oh, the only thing you can do are small actions like, I don't know, like voting, for example, which is all very good and it's very, very important. But sometimes you have to set the bar so high that even if it seems kind of too far away into the future or too unrealistic, at least you have that to shoot for. And I think that's very important to just kind of keep in mind.
You give us something to aim for, which I'm very grateful.